not going to read it aloud. You can look at it. I'll summarize it too. Okay, I'll start my time on my first word. I stand on the firmest of affirmation that this House supports the EU imposing sanctions and blocking the EU-Mercosur trade agreement on Brazil. We define this House as a rational actor and the weighing mechanism as net benefits. So let's go over what the situation is. So first, on Brazil, what's actually going on in Brazil in 2019 when this motion is set? Brazil is burning the Amazon rainforest to clear land, causing pollution and removing one of the largest carbon sinks in the world, causing it to emit more CO2 than it is absorbing because of this burning and because there is less left over. The effects of this extend for decades because rainforests are one of the most effective carbon sinks, meaning that they remove huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. However, to function as that sink, it needs huge amounts of biodiversity and older plants, meaning to get it back to a point where it is even absorbing carbon is going to take decades. So why is Brazil doing this? It seems like a pretty bad idea. Well, they're doing it in order to clear land, mostly for beef and soy production, to help stimulate their economy. It says it directly in the motion slide, like the leader is really motivated by trying to bolster their economy. And so Brazil's incentives, economic growth, supporting their citizens, and establishing trade, because that's one of the most important things for stable economic growth. And so we can say throughout this round, the thing that Brazil wants the most is to have like a bolstered, stable economy. Now, what is the trade plan? This trade plan is several European companies are set to create a deal that is going to produce 40 billion euros of capital benefits and entails major exports with Brazil. However, this plan is being blocked. And so this plan is being blocked by the EU. What is the EU doing? They're imposing sanctions in order to block the trade deal until Brazil agrees to do more to help the Amazon rainforest. Notice that the sanctions are likely to target top Brazilian officials or corporations that are engaged in burning the Amazon. That logically makes sense because those are the most effective types of sanctions. And the EU knows that they should target the people that are making the decisions. They don't get a lot of benefit from targeting corporations that aren't involved in this, that aren't benefiting from this. And we say that the EU is probably smart enough to be able to create sanctions that target those top officials and corporations. So, and then the sanctions removal are conditional on a pledge from Bolsonaro to do more to prevent the fires. So the motive of the EU, stop rainforest destruction and eventually allow this trade deal. Okay, our first contention is on stopping Brazil from burning the Amazon. Three main points under this. First, the Brazilian president is only authorizing the burning of the forest for profit motives. I don't think he inherently wants to just destroy the Amazon rainforest. He has the profit motive behind him. And so becoming less profitable means that the policy can become reversed. So why is this going to become unprofitable under our world? We think that the burning of the rainforest is only profitable by a small margin right now. That's because there are long-term problems with it. Yes, you'll make money for a couple years when climate change comes and makes it really hard for us to grow any food or have any agriculture. That's not going to be profitable. So it's short-term profit, not long-term. And so not to mention you lose the ecosystem services. There were also in 2019 huge proposals for carbon credit systems, which are touted to be super profitable. Well, note that in the current day, Brazil has indeed implemented a carbon credit system. So this pushes it over the brink to become unprofitable. We say that in the long term, and not even that long term, in the next couple years, this plan is really unprofitable for Brazil. And then also 40 billion euros is a ton of money, which is the predicted amount that they are getting from this trade deal. So obviously they have an incentive to want to make that money, which is going to be more stable and is not going to have these large long-term harms. Second is international backlash. Good relationships with the EU is critical for long-term economic growth. The EU is one of the biggest economies in the world. They have tons of trade partners within them. And so you don't want them to be an enemy. I think it's pretty clear that Brazil, if they're motivated by trying to create good economic growth, isn't going to want to make the EU an enemy. Furthermore, the EU has other allies that if the EU is hey, these people are terrible, they're destroying the environment, and guess what? That's going to hurt the entire world. We say that it's pretty logical that other countries may follow suit. And then third, the sanctions are targeted. As we said in framing, the sanctions are likely to target people like Bolsonaro or corporations that are burning the forest. I think that it's going to be really hard for opposition to come up here and say the EU is incapable of hiring economists that can figure out how to make sanctions that are targeted. We see this all the time. So that means that it'll become less and less profitable for Bolsonaro to maintain this practice. It also means that the corporations that are burning the forest are making less money doing it because they are now also sanctioned. So subpoint B. why is it so important to get Brazil to stop burning the Amazon? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I don't think the opposition is going to come up here and say, actually, it's good. We don't want the Amazon rainforest. But the Amazon is a major producer of all the oxygen on the earth. It's also home to tons of biodiversity. You notice that once you get rid of biodiversity, it is not going to come back. Opposition can't come up here and say, no, it's okay, they can burn the rainforest and then they'll regrow. That's not how biodiversity works, because we take away genetic diversity. And that means that if there's less biodiversity, if we destroy it, then there's less abilities for species to survive climate change, because you'll note that genetic diversity is crucial to adapt to changing atmospheres, like changing temperatures. Okay. Our second contention is on a signaling effect. Subpoint A is that the EU imposing these sanctions is a clear and aggressive signal to global actors that they are taking climate change seriously. Many international treaties and agreements on stopping climate change have just failed because there is no actual incentive for countries to agree to prevent climate change other than this like future impact. While catastrophic, it's easier to ignore because it's in the future. However, we argue that it is crucial for countries to actually be regulated and stop massively harmful activities, which include, the destruction of biodiversity, CO2 emissions, etc. And so economic incentives that hurt them right now, in like the hope of trying to make them stop doing these environmental impacts that are going to hurt everyone in the future, is going to incentivize them more to stop doing that because we see that they're being short-sighted. And then this action from the EU signals that they are willing to put economic factors at risk, something that arguably every country cares deeply about. I don't think there's a lot of countries that are like, no, we don't care about the economy. We have like other things to worry about, because the economy is like the health of the country, the health of the citizens, the ability for the country to like adapt to things. And so they're doing that in order to prioritize the impacts of climate change, signaling that they're very, very serious about protecting climate change. And then subpoint B, we say that this causes less climate abuse in other countries. Say you are a small country who does most of their trade with the EU. The EU just said that if you burn forests, you'll get trade cut off and sanctions imposed. You are just much more likely to be careful about the climate. We say that this happens in big countries, but especially in these small countries that rely more on the EU, and climate change affects the entire world. So the more we can stop countries doing harmful actions, the better. So the impact of this, other countries emit less harm to the environment. For these reasons, so proud to propose.
Sorry, there was just like a truck going by outside, so I'm just going to let this siren fade for a second. Okay, I think we're good. I am still Sam. If anyone isn't ready, please speak up. Okay. My time begins now. I want to begin at the top of case because there is a huge oversight my opponents make when they characterize what this round looks like. Then I'm going to provide two arguments from the opposition side in this debate, and then I'm going to respond to the government side's contentions. The most important thing that my opponents just ignore in this round is the incentives of Brazil. My opponents just say Brazil is incentivized to do whatever is going to be best for the Brazilian economy, just make the most net good. But what they ignore is who is actually in charge of Brazil. The person leading Brazil in 2019 is Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has a particular incentive as an elected official, which is to stay in power. He wants to continue to be the leader of Brazil. And when other nations decide whether or not to sanction Brazil, they need to consider how Bolsonaro, as the leader of Brazil, will actually decide to respond in turn. But Bolsonaro is not just like a random politician. He's a super far right-wing politician. He's super nationalist. A good way to think of him is like the Brazilian Trump. He wants to stay in power. When we evaluate sanctions, we need to think about how exactly he's going to act. There's another thing they talk about the top of case on how sanctions can be super targeted. This is the other thing. I guess I'll respond to this here, actually, when they tell you that sanctions can be super targeted. Firstly, sanctions have never been have just historically, sanctions are rarely just like, ooh, let's target this one company. Sanctions are almost always like large unilateral economic effects. There's a reason for this, which is sanctions can't motivate a nation unless they are painful for that nation. If you just go, hey, let me poke you a little bit, that doesn't get a nation as motivated. And secondly, that tiny companies literally can't be hit. If I'm like a Brazilian company doing deforestation, then I'm probably not doing like a huge amount of international business. And if the ability of the EU to sanction me is much less than to sanction like Brazil as a whole, or if you want to talk about Brazil specifically, their like steel industry is really, really huge. They export a lot of steel. They're much more likely to sanction Brazil by hitting their steel industry than industries which are local to Brazil, and thus are much harder for foreign nations to sanction. Now, moving on to the opposition case, we think that firstly, is just on sanction. The first contention from side off is just sanctions being bad. I think that there's a massive harm to the economy from sanctions for the precise reason I just outlined, that the companies you sanction are always going to be, like, even if it is just companies, massive international ones, because those are the ones the EU actually has access over. And that means when you sanction them, when you massively hurt the Brazilian economy, it is not the government who suffers. It is not the people burning the rainforest who suffer. The people who suffers are just like everyday Brazilian people living their lives who now suddenly don't have a job or suddenly don't have access to the kinds of economic resources they had before, as the country suffers economically from massive world powers shutting them out. The EU is important. If they do that, it's going to be really bad for the Brazilian people. The prices of stuff is going to go way up. Poverty is going to increase, and the people who suffer are never going to be people making any of these decisions. The people who suffer are going to be everyday people. The second subpoint under just sanctions being bad is that sanctions actually push the nation further right. When nations are seen as under attack, under international attack, this almost always strengthens conservative movements within the nation. Look at how Trump is fueled by Chinese, like perceived Chinese attacks on the United States. That like when in Brazil, a place where like there is a lot of far right sentiment, you have other nations seen as like aggressing them. Because keep in mind, this isn't just denying the trade deal. This is also imposing extra sanctions that, regardless of any economic impact, perceptually, this increases the like far right wing in Brazil, which is like not good. Second argument here is on the actual deal itself being good. This is really, really important. Bolsonaro, normally, if you didn't threaten him, would probably make the deal because you just sort of bring in more money and it's not to the expense of the Brazilian people who are relying on like deforestation in this meat industry for their job. You just sort of like, Bolsonaro does his thing, brings in some money. But Bolsonaro would never make the decision to prevent deforestation in order to make this deal. This is because Bolsonaro is a far right-wing populist figure who thrives on Brazil being first. Regardless of any actual economic impacts my opponents are going to talk about, Bolsonaro is never going to want to be seen as making a decision that harms the Brazilian people because Amazonian destruction is seen as so central to Brazilian jobs. Look at, for example, nationalist politics in the US as being a really good analog for this, that Trump, for example, supports massive tariffs on all foreign nations, not because this would be good for the US economy, but because he is a figure who fundamentally thrives on
Why?
Yes.
Do you think that Trump might actually think that those tariffs are good for the US economy, according to all of his rhetoric that says they will be?
I don't care. The point is he's never going to like the point of Trump is that he thrives off of the fact that these tariffs are going to be like keeping other nations out. When you listen to Trump speak, it is almost all xenophobic. There's not a lot of like actually looking at the economic data. That's not how he's persuading people. He's persuading people with foreign nations are bad, don't take their money. And so if Bolsonaro is seen by his own people, the people who elected him, as like foreign nations are bad, take their money, and Bolsonaro cuts down on local Brazilian jobs to take European Union money, it doesn't matter how the country's economy changes because Bolsonaro knows it's political suicide for him to do that. So he's never going to take the deal, which means any of the actual benefits, my opponents, like any of the actual benefits of like, oh, like $40 billion is significant. It'll help the Brazilian people to get this money. That like all of that goes away because Bolsonaro will never accept the deal. It's the EU just shooting this deal down for no reason because they've picked an ultimatum that Bolsonaro will never, ever concede to. Moving on to responding to my opponent's case. Their first contention is on stopping Brazil from burning the Amazon. Eloise is right. I'm not going to get up here and argue that like we should burn the Amazon. Like, yes, burning the Amazon is a bad thing to do. But fundamentally, we need to ask where is the money and who is giving it? Because fundamentally, you only can get a deal if without antagonizing Bolsonaro. But secondly, on international backlash, fundamentally, Bolsonaro, it's like not that big a deal. Because if it's not the EU, Bolsonaro can go to China. Bolsonaro go to these are nations who already have a relationship. International backlash, like, yeah, he'd like the EU support, but if it comes to it, like, Bolsonaro can go somewhere else. Then, lastly, On this idea of like sanctions being targeted, I already responded to that. And then on this last idea about why it's so important for him to stop burning the rainforest, I think it's really important that even if everything else I've said in this speech, judges, you don't buy it, just because burning the Amazon rainforest is bad doesn't mean this deal will actually long run get Bolsonaro to stop burning the Amazon rainforest. Even if my opponents are right about everything they said, there's nothing to stop Bolsonaro from just going, yeah, we promise we'll be good. They take the $4 billion and then he just goes back to burning the rainforest. Like fundamentally, even if my opponents are right about everything they will say in this round, there's no long-term staying power. You're this like far right authoritarian like leader. Second contention here, well, not authoritarian, far right. It is a democracy. Second contention here is it shows that the climate is important. I think that this is just exactly the opposite, because fundamentally what this says is not the EU will try to financially cooperate with you. What it says is that if you don't cooperate with the EU in full, they will put a gun to your head and force you to. But that's not actually a productive way of achieving climate cooperation. To achieve climate cooperation, you need to like actually get people to cooperate with you. And you don't want a country like China to be able to go, look at what the EU just did to Brazil, sanctioning them like that. Say, like industrialized country, you shouldn't work with them. You should work with us, because otherwise the EU will strongly arm you into doing whatever you want. Fundamentally, using sanctions and bullying other nations into doing what you want is never a good way of fostering international cooperation to try to stop climate change. Besides, the EU can do this regardless. The EU, it's not like whether or not this deal happens in Brazil is going to prevent the EU from offering some financial incentive to somebody else for doing climate change, some other politician who might be more receptive and not literally relying on this nationalist rhetoric to get themselves elected. Thus, I urge an opposition ballot.
All right. My name is still Jacob Goldman. Second speaker for op. Okay. Let's start on the top of case, where my opponents tell you that we mischaracterize the incentives of Bolsonaro, or we sort of ignore them. The thing is, okay, and my opponents correctly characterize that Bolsonaro is like far right. But we have a couple responses here. First of all, yeah, Bolsonaro isn't great, but he is a capitalist. Like, he's a really hardcore capitalist that wants his economy to grow, partially so he can make money, so partially the economy does better for his citizens, and partially because if you have a really good economy going into election year, that's pretty good. But second of all, far right, like being on the far right in a country like Brazil is just different than what my opponents characterize as being on the far right in the US. Because in the US, maybe that looks like Trump, but in most countries across the world, including in Brazil, being on the far right means being on the economically far right. It means saying, get the government out of my economy. So yeah, he's on the far right in that sense. But that means that he's a capitalist who cares about the economy and how it does. So he still cares about whether or not these sanctions and this block trade deal will hurt him. I'll characterize why those things do hurt him and the economy writ large. Let's go to the opposition case, where they gave us a contention about how sanctions are bad. And they say subpoint A is that sanctions are going to hurt businesses. They're going to hurt people. Two responses. First of all, we think we can minimize the extent to which you are really, really harming the people, because you can target these things. My opponents say you can't really, and that's historically not true. You can. You target first of all Bolsonaro, and you stop, for example, these companies that are burning the trees from importing goods that they might either want or need to burn the trees, axes from abroad, steel from abroad. You also stop them from buying, like, farming equipment that they might be using on deforested land. That is something that affects those companies. Second of all, yes, we're going to concede that these sanctions are going to hurt some people a little bit in the long term, or in the short term. That's true. The thing is, you just have to do it. You have to do it because there's a short time frame on the Amazon rainforest's life. You have to do it because if you hurt people right now, those people say, hey, I don't want to be hurt. Hey, why am I hurt? Why is the economy doing bad? Why are things more expensive? Oh, hey, we're getting sanctioned by the EU. Hey, Bolsonaro, do you want to make that stop happening? Do you want to not make us burn the Amazon rainforest, which the average person isn't benefited by, but you want to stop me from being sanctioned? Thanks, that'd be great. So Bolsonaro does stop it because he does, as my opponents tell you, want to be reelected. On their subpoint B, my opponents tell you that you push the nation further right. Two responses. First of all, I just don't think it's not true. Like, I don't think the average person, after being hit with some sanctions, or their economy doesn't do very well, or these companies who are no longer able to get the goods to deforest, go, we gotta fight and beat the EU. They go, oh my God, I'm hungry. And then they want those sanctions to stop because the average person just isn't caring that much about beating down the EU. They care about eating their food. Bolsonaro cares about having money and being elected. But the second response here is, again, that the far right in Brazil is like economically far right. So the extent that you can move further right isn't like a large impact here. On their subpoint sees that the deal is good itself. And they tell you, again, Bolsonaro would just never make a deal because he already made this thing where he allowed companies to deforest. He doesn't want to go back on his word. He doesn't want to look stupid. He's a lot like Trump. There's nationalist rhetoric. Okay, couple responses. First of all, as I've said, he's an ultra right-wing, ultra capitalist. He wants the country to make money. He wants the country to have richer people. He wants his country to advance so that people are doing better, so that his country does better in the larger economic and global order. So if he figures out that he's hurting his economy, or if this trade deal is hurting his economy, that's really, really bad for him. Bolsonaro and the people feel the effects. But second of all, it's just like my opponents tell you that it's political suicide to like go back on your word. I don't think that's true, given that there's like a lot of complicated like deal logistics things that you can just justify to the average person that just say like, you know what, it's now time to stop it. You're able to justify it. Comparatively, it is political suicide to go into an election year with a flailing economy when the whole point of the Bolsonaro administration is like, we're going to be a far right election, or a far right administration that's going to allow the economy to boom. So just like the US, when you go into an election with a bad economy, people start to think, ooh, maybe we want someone else. Maybe we want someone who can fix the economy. Bolsonaro doesn't want that, as my opponents characterize. You can also still maintain your far right status while like doubling back on the ability to burn the rainforest. Because I just don't think it's true that burning the rainforest, the Amazon, is integral to far right politics. You can still be a populist. You can still do all of those things while maintaining your far right status in the way that Bolsonaro wants. Let's go to the government case. Okay. Now, the first thing that my opponents say on our first contention is that you can go to other countries like China and Russia, but there's an extent to which you can trade with China and Russia because there are just some goods you want from the EU, but also the EU is just one of the biggest economies in the world, one of the most productive economies in the world. So if you suddenly can't trade there and there are sanctions there, that really does hurt no matter whether like China and Russia exist. But I also want to note here, my partner gave you 3 unique reasons about why these sanctions will be effective in stopping the burning of the rainforest. Each one of them went dropped. My partner told you that the Brazilian president is authorizing this because he wants to make money. That's very, very, very clear. He doesn't do it because he's like, I actually hate like animals. He's doing it because he thinks it's good for the economy. But that's a balance. It's a close balance. It's not totally clear to how much it's going to be profitable. So if we make it unprofitable, which they don't contest it will, he's not going to do it anymore. Second of all, we talk about international backlash. It's just a really bad idea to have bad relations indefinitely with one of the biggest economies in the world. You want to think long term. Third of all, we talked about sanctions being targeted. Each one of these went dropped. I'll give you, in fact, a fourth reason why this policy is going to stop Bolsonaro from doing this. And that reason is about the balancing of the currency. In 2019, and still, the Brazilian currency was doing badly. You can look, it was like fluctuating. You can look to like Brazil like losing its position in BRICS. It just wasn't doing well as an economy. And as a result, its currency was fluctuating, which is probably really bad for an economy. The thing is, when you have international trade that stabilizes the currency, because there are more people who hold the currency in their country, which means there's more institutional belief and trust in the currency, which means you get a stabler currency, and that lets you have more trade internationally. It lets you have a better economy domestically. There are 4 unique reasons, therefore, that it will become unprofitable and not politically good for Bolsonaro to continue allowing companies to burn the forest. And I've proven to you that the economic motive is the one that Bolsonaro cares about. He cares about having an economy that is doing well. And my opponents needed just a ton more analysis to prove to you why it's still profitable, even though the balance is close right now between being profitable and unprofitable, why it's still profitable after this to change. Okay, I also want to note on subpoint B, they sort of blow off the impacts of this. They sort of say it's not that big. They sort of imply it. I want to note how short the lifespan of the Amazon forest is, because in 2019, they are rapidly burning it. And it is one of the biggest like biodiversity sources and carbon sinks in the world. And if it goes away, the planet's going to be really hurt. People across the world die from CO2 emissions. That's really, really bad. It's time to act. We're just clearly outweighing. The second contention about a signaling effect, they talk about it's like not a good way to enforce that a country changes climate operations because like it looks like you are bullying. Okay, a couple responses. Two responses. First of all, like what do you want the people to do about the forest being burned then? Like, do you want the EU to ask really nicely, or do you want to not strong arm them? There's just no other way to do it, and it's a necessary impact. But second of all, I just don't think that other countries decide like I'm not going to trade with the EU because they're going to strong arm me. They want to trade with the EU because it's incredibly profitable. At the end of this debate, at the end of this speech, then you can show that it's profitable for Brazil to stop burning the forest, so they'll stop doing it. For those reasons, I affirm.
Perfect. Is everybody ready? Okay, then before I start, I think I'm going to be going a little bit quicker than usual because I have a lot to get through. If at any point I'm going too fast and you can't understand what I'm saying, please call slap. If everybody's still ready, I'm going to start my time now. The order is going to be just an overview, gov case in order, op case in order. Okay. On the top, I think my opponent's case is based on a fundamentally flimsy model of the world. What do they tell you in their top of case, in their PMC? They say Brazil just wants to maximize profit. Thus, their entire case, all of their offense is about how they think that these sanctions or like taking the plan would actually maximize profit. They think this is enough for you to cast a gov ballot, but it's not. Why is this? Because Brazil is not actually only interested in maximizing its profit. Bolsonaro is its leader, and Bolsonaro is interested in maintaining his power and appealing to supporters who are largely right-wing and have bought into his Brazil-first rhetoric. I mean, you don't even need to trust me. You can also look to the analysis that Gov gives you themselves, which is that it is independently economically bad for Brazil to continue burning the rainforest in 2019, because in the long term, it harms their ecosystem while failing to provide continuous economic impacts. If, as Gov tells you, Bolsonaro is only concerned with the economy and maximizing economic growth over the long term, he would have already told his people independently to stop burning the rainforest. Why doesn't he do that? Because the people who are burning the rainforest for land are the everyday Brazilians to whom Bolsonaro wants to appeal. He is fundamentally not interested in just creating economic growth. He is interested in seeming as though he is protecting the average Brazilian from the incursions of like Western liberal democracies and their like free trade.
Information.
No, thank you. I'll take it later if I have time. Okay. Then in the top of the MG, they try to give you two reasons why this isn't actually true. Here's why neither of them is enough to take out like this model of the world that Sam presents to you. First, they tell you Bolsonaro is a capitalist. Sure, Bolsonaro is a capitalist, but people can say that they're capitalisms and still be anti-globalization and still be anti-like global trade. You can look to Trump as an example of this. Sam tells you that Bolsonaro is effectively the Brazilian Trump. There's a reason why these two leaders have good relationships with each other. Protectionism is a philosophy that's always existed. You can also look to the overall like rightward trend in Latin American countries because there were a ton of like really left-leaning movements that did really bad things in their nations. For this reason, a lot of them tend to be more fiscally conservative. They tend to do not trust Western liberal democracies and not want to trade with them. You can be a capitalist and also a protectionist. What Sam tells you and then Gov never interacts with is this idea that the protectionism, that the Brazil first rhetoric comes before everything else. It comes before the capitalism. It comes before the profit incentives. At the point at which Gov fails to address this in MG, they've clean lost the round. Then secondly, we hear this like blanket response that like the far right is different in Brazil and different in the US. Sure, it is different, but the protectionist rhetoric stays the same and they can't hand wave away this difference by saying, but Bolsonaro is not exactly like Trump. Maybe not exactly, but their incentives and policy platforms are similar. Again, that's why they have a good relationship. This is the most important characterization in the round. If you take nothing else away from my speech, let it be this. Let it be the fact that for Bolsonaro, the most important thing is not the economy, it's protectionism. It's looking like he cares the most about the Brazilian people. Sam tells you this, the MG drops it, and it's too late for you to hear anything new from that in the PMR. Now let's go on to the Gov case. Their C1 is on stopping Brazil from burning the Amazon. They have 3 subpoints. I guess we hear a 4th one in the MG. Here's why none of them stand. The first one is this idea of economic growth. We hear a couple of warrants here, right? Eloise tells you that, you know, if it's not economically beneficial for Bolsonaro to keep keep burning the rainforest, he's not going to do it because he has no other reason to care about burning the rainforest, right? Like he doesn't care about like the animals that live there, so he's just going to stop burning it. But again, what they failed to do is to understand this other reason that he has, which is not about like caring about like animals. It's about not wanting to look like he's bowing to outside pressure. It's about not wanting to look like he's killing Brazilian jobs for the sake of an international trade deal. Again, Sam tells you this and you just don't hear enough MG interaction with it. We hear this idea that like he still cares about profit, he still cares about capitalism. We're not saying he doesn't, but what we're saying is he cares about protectionism first because that's how he maintains his power. That's how he appeals to his people. Both sides agree Brazil is a democracy in which Bolsonaro wants to appeal to the people. What is the best way for him to do that? To use this right-wing protectionist Brazil first rhetoric that the people of Brazil love. I think on this economic growth point, it's like really clear that you're going to be turning this towards off. Then secondly is on this idea of international backlash. I think first you can extend the mitigation that Sam gives you here that clean takes it out. Bolsonaro has other options, right? He is able to trade with Russia. He's able to trade with China. And indeed, he imposes his own tariffs against EU nations all the time because he is fundamentally concerned with the domestic industry and not like maintaining a good international community. The international backlash thing has little to no impact on him. But then turn. No, thank you. Secondly, is this turn, the international backlash implications here actually flow up as a reason for Bolsonaro not to take the deal. Because again, what he cares about first and foremost is not establishing friendly relationships, although he wouldn't mind that if he could get it. What he cares about is Brazil first always at the expense of other nations. If he makes this decision to like prioritize other nations and this like international relationship that actively looks bad for him, it is against his own best interests. And the Gov just doesn't do any incentive analysis as to why he uniquely cares about that, other than saying the EU is powerful. The EU is powerful, but as Sam explains, so is China, so is Russia. If he can trade with them and like still gain the support of his citizens, he's going to choose to do that. Then third, they give you this warrant, which is about the sanctions being targeted. I think that this kind of gets dropped in the MG because as Sam explains to you, targeted sanctions like don't really exist. The point of sanctions is to hurt the people in a nation. We think that they are going to continue to hurt people in the nation and they can't actually just target like the upper class elites. That's not the real sanctions. Okay. Then we hear this fourth layer of analysis in the MG, which is about balancing currency. We think the average voter doesn't vote on currency getting balanced. It doesn't really work as a voting issue the same way like protecting Brazilian jobs counts as like a voting issue. Most people aren't thinking about it like that. And then when Gov tells you that like it's an election year, so what he's going to do is try to maximize the way that like people are going to vote for him in the election. I think it's important to note that like in the 2020 election, Bolsonaro won. So clearly he was okay with not balancing the currency and people were still fine with voting for him. He knew that would be the case because again, he knew he was able to rely on his platform of Brazil first rhetoric and not like just like defaulting to other nations' currencies. Okay, but then finally, why is the reason why you're actually not voting for this argument, even if you don't believe a single word that I've just said? Because Gov drops Sam's terminal defense on this argument, which is first, in the status quo, the Amazon is still getting burned, Gov didn't solve. And then secondly, even if what happened in the status quo didn't happen and Bolsonaro did take the deal, it would still get burned because Gov actually has no mechanism for why once he takes the deal, he's going to actually like hold true to his word and then he's not going to just keep burning the rainforest. We think that if it's in his best interest, if he thinks it's in his best interest, he's going to just keep burning it. Gov drops this in the MG. They fundamentally have no offense left on the flow. You're not going to be able to vote for them there. Then their second contention here is about like showing that the climate is important to other nations. This is really marginal. You don't want to vote here because if in other nations where like they don't have governments that's like Bolsonaro, it's beneficial for the EU to sanction those nations. They can do that regardless of whether or not Bolsonaro takes this deal. It's not actually important to this round. Now let's go into the op case. Why can you flow through everything that we've told you here? On our first argument about sanctions being bad, we hear this Gov mitigation that's about like minimizing the extent of them with a careful analysis. Again, I think that like this is just mitigation, and at the end of the day, it's not ultimately that successful insofar as the MG tells you themselves that like you can't actually create sanctions that do that. The point of sanctions is fundamentally to harm nations, thus you cannot have sanctions that don't harm the nation. Then on this idea about pushing nations further right, we hear this like hand-wavy analysis from Gov and the MG that like the average person after being hit with sanctions doesn't want to go far right. This isn't true. I mean, you can look to the US as an example of this. Trump is largely supported by people in poverty who are adversely impacted by the tariffs that he's placing on other nations because it raises the prices of goods for them. People nonetheless still support him, and they nonetheless still buy into this America First rhetoric because people are not always rational actors, and people, especially in these like more right-wing environments, tend to want to put their country first. That is the most important line of analysis in the round, and again, there's just not sufficient Gov interaction with it. Then on the second argument that the deal is going to be good, Gov just responds by saying, okay, but he's ultra-capitalist, so he's going to take the deal. But the issue is he doesn't take the deal, and he's not going to take the deal because capitalism isn't his number one priority. What we tell you is he is going to take this deal, and he is going to bring money to the Brazilian people if and only if it doesn't like harm his number one incentive, which is this Brazil first protectionist rhetoric. And at the end of the day, what Gov fails to do is explain to you how he's able to make these two things, the Brazil first rhetoric and harming Brazilian industry, in order to open things up to this like international trade deal. Gov is able to explain to you how these two things can coexist. Insofar as they cannot coexist, and we've proven that to you, what we think that Bolsonaro is going to care about is always going to be this number one incentive. When Gov fails to interact with that, they lose the round. Never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Assuming everyone's still ready, I'm still Sam. My time begins now. This speech is going to have two parts. Firstly, I'm going to imagine my opponents are right about everything they've said about Bolsonaro and everything else in this round, and show you why it's still a clean opposition ballot. And then I'm going to go through and look at who Bolsonaro is and how he's actually likely to act. Firstly, though, let's do that thought experiment. What if my opponents were right about everything they said? The key thing here is the analysis that I read in the LOC that gets dropped in the second Gov speech, and that Zoe then extends in her speech. Don't let them make a new response in the final speech, which is that there is no actual way of stopping Bolsonaro from just immediately going back to burning the rainforest after the deals go through. Once again, don't let them make a new response in PMR. We've been reading this since the first speech, and they just haven't responded. This is literally what happened in the real world, is that the Amazon rainforest is still getting burned. This means there's two impacts in the round. There's the sort of harms of sanctions that we talk about, how sanctions cannot be targeted by their very nature, because one, the EU doesn't care about protecting the average Brazilian person. They're not going to spend the time to worry about that. And two, it's literally not possible for the US to sanction small farming companies in Brazil, or even large ones that are going to sanction things that actually get exported out of Brazil, which make up the entire Brazilian economy. What that means is that there's two impacts. Harms versus sanctions versus the impact of temporarily blocking the Amazon from being burned. And there's two key reasons why you end up preferring op here. Firstly, it's just, yes, that burning the Amazon is really bad, but insofar as you're only temporarily blocking it, there's other people who are doing other things to solve climate change. Whether or not you temporarily stop the Amazon from being burned is not going to be the end-all be-all for whether or not we stop climate change, whereas there's nobody else trying to help the Brazilian poor. When you put on these sanctions, you immediately harm those people. There's no one else trying to help them. But secondly is on the long-term consequences, because sanctions have disastrous long-term economic impacts. Look, for example, at sanctions imposed on Venezuela or Cuba, which still have economic impacts to this day. Whereas if you just stop the Amazon rainforest getting burned for even 10 years, you're still going to burn it eventually. You're still going to have that climate change eventually. We are the only side which is actually able to have these kinds of long-term impacts. But let's get real, because Bolsonaro is not super capitalist literally. He says he's capitalist in the same way that Trump says he's capitalist, but also supports massive tariffs on foreign nations. My opponents say that Bolsonaro can maintain far-right status while burning the rainforest, but the point is not that it's specifically the rainforest. The point is that rainforests are local jobs, which he is stifling for foreign jobs, something that is literally untenable for a politician who literally thrives on Brazil-first rhetoric. The average voter is not concerned about what Jacob talks about. Jacob is a really smart person who knows about how currency fluctuations happen. And I could talk about that right now, but the important thing is the average voter is not voting on how exactly the Brazilian currency is going to fluctuate in different directions. The average voter is going to be their nation should be first, and Bolsonaro can do that. The average voter is not concerned about whether or not Bolsonaro has international backlash from the EU. The average voter cares about the fact that there's going to be widespread media about how Bolsonaro is taking away local good Brazilian jobs working the land. But even if, judges, you weren't sure about how Bolsonaro is now, if you put sanctions on him, he will have to be nationalist then. This is our second subpoint, which gets really no response, that attacking people with sanctions increases xenophobic sentiments, not decreases them. If I lose my job because a foreign nation took it, I'm obviously not going to go, yeah, of course, I'm going to vote for the guy who wants to become chummy with those very same nations. I'm going to go, I can't trust these foreigners who made me lose my job. This is what happened in the US. It's not just that Trump is nationalist, but that antagonism with China made Trump more nationalist. With the same logic, it's not just that Bolsonaro is nationalist right now, but when you put sanctions on him, when you antagonize the very people who he needs to win elections with, when foreign nations do that, Bolsonaro will have to take a strong stance against those foreign nations to get elected, not go, yeah, I'm going to make a big trade deal with the people who stole your jobs. At that point in the round, Bolsonaro can never take the deal because he'll never get reelected and he'll never be able to maintain power. That means he never gets the benefits of the deal. The Brazilian people never get the benefits of the deal. The Brazilian people suffer from sanctions, and the world never even gets any climate policy at all. You piss off somebody and tell him to give up the one thing that he can never lose. He doesn't give it up, and the world is punished for it. I urge an opposition ballot.
Okay, is everyone ready? I'll begin my time. Now, I still stand on the firmest of affirmation of the resolution. Okay, so opposition came up here and did quite a bit of incentives analysis for you, so I'm going to start with that. Let's look at the most recent election in the US. What was the biggest issue? The economy. They want to make all these comparisons about Trump is Bolsonaro is their Trump. Okay, the economy was the most important thing to Trump voters. They hate Biden's economy and they wanted a different one. So I think it's not hard to buy that the economy is pretty important to almost every voter. So if you buy that Bolsonaro's main motive is getting reelected, then you should buy that maybe he doesn't want to have a failing economy going into an election year. When the economy is crashing and an average person is losing money, then we say that Brazil's people are not going to be like, yes, nationalism, let's isolate. No, they're going to be like, hey, make the deal that stops us from being economically harmed. Brazilians care about the economy, and so does Bolsonaro. Plus, Brazil is like far right economically, which is really different from far right in the US. There just isn't like Brazil first rhetoric. Brazilians are poor in 2019. They want money, they want food, they want this trade deal that is going to help them, not sanctions. Op is just assuming that there is Brazil first rhetoric because there is America first rhetoric. Brazil isn't America. They want to have capitalist economic growth, which is directly hurt by the plan. They are not getting more economic growth by burning the rainforest. That's just simply not true. But even if you believe that there is Brazil first rhetoric, think about how Brazil becomes first. Is it by burning Amazon to maybe have just in 3 years that are in 10 years? Or is it making trade deals that are stable and long term? But also, as Op tells you, nationalist rhetoric exists because Bolsonaro wants to win an election. But then they drop that the economy is key to winning that election. The most important thing to Bolsonaro is the economy. And so when that crashes, voters won't vote for him. I think the average voter probably votes on the fact that they can't afford food. If they want to frame that voters are stupid and can't think about long-term impacts, then I think that's an even simpler thing to vote on is I can't afford food right now. I don't like the economy. And then they try and tell you that Bolsonaro hates other countries and doesn't want to collaborate with them. First, then why would he make this plan in the first place with the EU? Obviously, he wants economic growth. Obviously, that's the best way to get it. And second, then how are we supposed to have any ability to stop them from burning the Amazon through like really, really nice treaties? We have to strongman them. At the point where they argue this, they can see that they have no ability to stop Brazil from burning the Amazon rainforest in their world. Okay, first voter issues on short-term impacts. Judge, every mile of the Amazon that is being burned is biodiversity that takes decades to regenerate, if we even can. But sure, the short term in this might be like most important to Bolsonaro. So you know what's important to Bolsonaro? His economy and getting reelected. Yeah, we concede some people are probably going to get hurt by these sanctions. We say that yes, the sanctions can probably be targeted towards these large corporations and ones involved with the burning, but yeah, everyday people are going to be hurt. Sure. Guess what? Then those everyday people are going to be like, hey, stop doing this plan. We're not going to vote for you because the most important thing to voters is the economy, is putting food on the table, is economic growth. Like Bolsonaro is not some tree-hating dictator who wants to like burn the Amazon rainforest. He thinks that is the most profitable thing. As soon as that's not the most profitable thing anymore, he's not going to do that. They tell you that they can just like go trade with other countries. There's only an extent to which you can do this. China, Russia, and et cetera, cannot provide the success and products the same ones that the EU does. Like at some point, you need to swallow your pride and trade with countries that may not be like your favorite. The success that they can get from the EU, from this trade deal is not comparable by just being like, well, maybe China and Russia can also come up with a deal. That's probably not going to happen. And then they tell you that he can just go back on his word. Let me cross-apply something I said in the first minute of my first speech. The removal of these sanctions is conditional on him not burning the Amazon. So do you think if he starts burning the Amazon, the EU isn't just going to like notice and be like, hey, we're putting these sanctions back on you? Like that's pretty easy logic. So if you want to prove that sanctions work, and if you want to prove that sanctions work, Brazil literally did impose a carbon credit system like after 2019. Okay, our second voter issue is on the long term. Judge, the most important thing in this round is
I think this analysis about any kind of like policy, like carbon credit policy Brazil did is definitely.
We said this in this first speech about the carbon credit. Okay, I'll continue my time now. So on long term, the most important thing in this round is stopping climate change. They try and like minimize these impacts. Judge, this affects every single person on the planet. At the point where Brazil is burning one of the most large carbon sinks in the world, we must prioritize them not doing that. The long-term impacts on the economy by making this deal are far better than burning the Amazon rainforest. I don't think Brazilians are stupid and just can't put this together. Like, I think that the opposition characterizes Brazilians as just like really stupid and only voting on just like this Brazil first rhetoric. I think they can put 2 and 2 together, or they can just vote on the economy being bad after he doesn't do the deal. And we tell you that the signaling effects of putting climate change above the economy from the EU is critical to creating actual change. friendly treaties don't work in the past, they're not going to work in the future. And they can tell you that people don't care about Brazilian currency fluctuations. Yeah, but they care about the economy doing well. They care about that more than anything else, and currency crashes really harm the economy. If you believe that there is even a small chance of stopping the burning, and if you believe that people are going to be angry when their economy crashes and they can't afford food, vote Gov. Thank you. That was a great round.
That was a great round.
Really fun.
just to make sure that judges are still putting in their votes. That's what we're waiting on at this point. It seems like the panel decision is still incomplete. Can we just confirm there are judges still who haven't put in their decision?
Yeah, there are some judges. Deciding. I will read. I will let everyone know as soon as all the ballots are in.
Believe ballots are finished.
Okay, so it looks like after what was quite a short deliberation, um, all the ballots are in. So I will read the results. It was a 4-1, and then I'll let the squirrel go first. But obviously before that, just big congratulations to both teams. Obviously, for making it to finals. That being said, it was a 4-1 ballot for the government side. So congrats, guys. And Richard, I believe you were the squirrel, so I'll let you start it off.
Yeah, so I actually thought that Horace Mann had a better grasp of the understanding of the situation in Brazil, and that he was Brazil's Trump, and that China is the overwhelming partner for Brazilian foodstuffs, and so they basically don't need the EU or other countries. And the reality is, Bolsonaro, I don't know how much you guys actually knew this, but when they actually threatened sanctions, he went and he said, "Oh, let's put out some fires," but the deforestation of the Amazon still grew tremendously. He just simply didn't care. I think it would have been good if Gov could have argued why sanctions can be removed and opposed based on day-to-day status of the Amazon. That could have taken away some of the bite of the opposition. Yeah, I mean, it's late. I'll leave it at that. But I think you both did great. I voted for both of you in previous debates earlier today, and I think you're all amazing debaters.
Would anyone want to go next, or should I give my RFD? Okay, it doesn't seem like one want to. Okay, so I made my decision on 3 levels. Again, I hate to do this because usually I'm a flow judge. I go through like each argument one by one, but I kind of had to narrow this debate because it got a little messy. So first, I look at the environment. So generally, I do buy that there is a positive effect on the environment because I do get these 2 points from Eloise. First, that the deal says that they can't say yeah to the deal and then just like continue to burn the environment right after. Like, I don't think that's how it works. But two, that Brazil implemented a carbon credit system right after, so we can actually see like change historically as a result of this deal. Second, I look at the economy, and I do buy that the economy will be worse if Bolsonaro doesn't accept because of these 4 main pieces of analysis. First, that sure, there are short-term profits, but in the long term, you're burning this ecosystem, which Brazil is fundamentally dependent on and which will have bad impacts. Two, I get this point on international backlash, which is like obviously you don't want the EU as an enemy. And even if you go to Russia and China, you're still one missing out on a huge economic powerhouse in the EU, and two, losing access to certain products the EU offers. Third, although this had less of an impact, I do buy the point that sanctions are targeted. I mean, you can target Bolsonaro officials and bad corporations. I get this point that the EU has good economists, which can probably make effective sanctions. And the fourth point is that the Brazilian currency was doing bad, which affects an economy. And when you have international trade, it makes it better. Now, the third place I'm voting on is Bolsonaro and the election. So if we even accept that Bolsonaro's Brazil before anything rhetoric exists, which is still contested, you can look at the analysis I think Jacob gives you on how Brazil's definition of the far right is fundamentally different and how Bolsonaro is more so like an ultra-capitalist. I think that even if we accept this thing, I think that the economy always matters the most during election time and can still fall under this Brazil first rhetoric. I think that the average voter in Brazil believes that putting the Brazilian economy first matters more than just like ideological protectionism and stopping the country's interaction from outer economic powerhouses. And I also get this analysis in the third speech that like obviously Bolsonaro isn't protectionist because he made this like agreement with other powers in the first place, which kind of just pushes me over the edge on the issue of Bolsonaro and the election. And yeah, that's my reason for decision.
I can go next. Um, so just to start off, I just like didn't buy the thing that Bolsonaro would just like ignore the deal stuff because like they would just put the strings back on. I think Gov properly refuted that. So like that's a pretty big point. I just didn't buy it, which like leads me to like I don't know, just like I just side with Gov because like I feel like this case was really just about something that doesn't matter as much because like a lot of the debate was about Brazilian voters and like the Brazilian election and stuff like that. But this house is like a rational actor, and I don't really see why the rational actor would care about how the election goes or how the Brazilian economy flows when like they're getting burnt to a crisp. I think like a rational actor would just like think, okay, whatever, I don't really care about the election. I don't want to get like killed by climate change, right? But like even then I did still consider like all the election stuff, I still think Gov wins because like with the whole like election thing, as Alex said, like I don't think any voter is going to care about protectionism and like keeping their country like isolated or whatever it is over like putting food on the table. I think if you put yourself in the shoes of one of those Brazilians, like you're not going to be like, okay, we have a protectionist state. I can't eat, but like at least we have a protectionist state, right? No, nobody's gonna think that way. People are gonna want to feed their families before like enforcing this ideology that the like president upholds. Like, I just think that a lot of these like mini debates within this debate just weren't something that should have been in this debate. And I think even if we do consider them, I just think Gov won on them anyways. Let me see if I have something on the economy. Hold on. I just didn't think like I also like on the economy, I didn't really think it mattered. Like I just think 9 times out of 10, the world not like imploding because of climate change matters more than the economy because like it does. Um, anyways, I'm not gonna like lie and say I like completely grasp this round. So like my decision's probably pretty flawed and I apologize for that because like I didn't truly fully understand this. But I did my best. Thank you.
I can go next. For me, it came down to Balanarso's incentive to change policy to win re-election, and I think AF offered the more plausible plan. I think because NEG kind of collapsed on economic collapse as a result of the sanctions, a lot of other parts of the round became irrelevant because AF does a really good job turning this and saying that a good economy is essential for Balanarso to win re-election. I think NEG's come back to this talking about Brazil first ideology, and this really good warrant of the working class in the US voting for Trump is really good. But I think the MG does a couple of really good points of analysis that NEG kind of drops. I think I buy, like the other judges have said really easily, that voters care about putting food on the plate before they do ideological commitments. But also MG gives this really great analysis as to how Bolsonaro can kind of get out of the deal in a ton of very realistic ways while saving face and still seeming committed to Brazil first. I think Neg drops this. And I think by the end of the MG, I'm able to buy that, Bolsonaro bowing to the sanctions is not intrinsically tied to him losing this Brazil first support, that he can rhetorically paint this in a ton of different ways. So I'm just voting for the contentions from government C1 on climate change. I think the neg defense on time frame is sufficiently anticipated by AF when they kind of paint it as try or die and how the forest is uniquely important to solving climate change. So by the end of the round, I was pretty comfortable casting an affirmation ballot.
Okay. I guess everyone already said like basically everything. Um, I guess what I voted on was actually like really similar to what Paul voted on. I kind of agreed about like the entire like Brazil election thing. Like this went on for like the majority of the round, but I agree with Paul as to like why would a rational individual necessarily care if like care about like Bolsonaro's like incentives into like getting reelected? Like I feel like if the framework is like net benefits and this person is just any like rational individual, and chances are they're not going to be Brazilian, right? Like they care more about the climate change, which makes it more compelling. Like their Gov C1 is more compelling to me, and especially when they tell me at the end of at in their last speech that like this ultimately will affect everyone, and if our framework is based off of net benefits and if it's not specifically about like Brazil or anything, as a rational individual, it's more intuitive to me and it's more compelling that that like they would care more about climate change. And yeah, and like Paul, like even if the like election thing, like if even if that would like skew my decision, I bought Gov's analysis onto how like what Alex said earlier about how like if it's an election year, that means the economy is going to be like a major voting issue. And then they also bring up like like how for the major voting issue like for a lot of Trump supporters is the economy. And that's what made me buy Gov's analysis on like the economy is would like be the most important, would help Bolsonaro get reelected. Um and yeah, like I buy ops contentions to an extent, but I just feel like there wasn't like enough for me to like impact out, especially with like a lot of the round being specifically about like this Brazilian debate or like election that wouldn't necessarily impact like everyone in the world and the rational individual wouldn't necessarily care about. And that's pretty much how I came to my decision.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Thank
That
you.
was a great round. Thank you for judging. Have a great one, everyone.
Pleasure
Congratulations,
judging.
everyone.
Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
great night. Congratulations.